She had been sitting in the waiting area of Hargrove Medical Center for 3 hours. Not because she had an appointment, but because she had calculated that the chief of medicine crossed the lobby at 7:40 every morning on his way from the parking structure to the elevator bank on the north side. She had watched him do it on a Tuesday, then again on a Wednesday, then again on a Thursday. She knew which elevator he preferred. She knew he carried his coffee in his left hand and his badge in his right. She knew he never looked at the chairs along the east wall, because the chairs along the east wall were for patients, and he had stopped seeing patients 11 years ago. She was 51 years old. Her name was Claudette Morrow. She was wearing the same gray blazer she had worn to every job interview in the past 8 months. The left pocket had a small tear near the lining that she had sewn closed 3 times. She carried one folder. Inside the folder were 4 documents she had spent 6 weeks preparing. She did not have a resume that would get her past the front desk. She had something else entirely. She had a reason to be in that building that had nothing to do with the job she was about to ask for. Dr. Holt Evershaw was 58 years old. He had run the clinical operations division of Hargrove Medical Center for 14 years. Before that, he had been a practicing cardiologist at a hospital in Philadelphia that no longer existed under the same name. He had built his reputation not on bedside manner, which was cold, but on institutional efficiency, which was exceptional. Hargrove had gone from a mid-tier regional hospital to a ranked teaching facility in the time he had been there. He had done this through a system. Every department reported upward through a chain of accountability that he had designed personally. Every budget line was reviewed quarterly. Every outcome metric was measured against a national benchmark and then against itself the previous year. He did not believe in hiring people he had not vetted. He did not believe in sentiment. He did not believe that good intentions produced good outcomes. He believed in process, because process was reproducible, and reproducible was the only thing that scaled. He crossed the lobby at 7:46 on a Friday morning, and the woman in the gray blazer stood before he reached the elevator. She did not step in front of him. She positioned herself so that the path to the elevator ran past her, and she spoke when he was close enough that stopping to respond was less disruptive than walking through her words. "Dr. Evershaw, I am not here for a patient appointment. I need 45 seconds. He stopped, not because he was moved, because the sentence structure was efficient, and he had spent 14 years rewarding efficiency. What position? Dietary services, or housekeeping, or materials management, anywhere you have an opening. He looked at her the way he looked at a facility report before he decided whether to read it. Age, posture, hands, the folder under her arm. The way she was standing, not leaning, not reaching, just standing the way someone stands when they have been waiting for a long time and have used the waiting to prepare rather than to worry. He did not say yes. He said, "I will have someone from HR call you." She handed him the folder before he finished the sentence. "The number is on the front page. They can call, but I will be here Monday at 6. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. He took the elevator. She sat back down in the chair along the east wall and waited until 8:15 to make sure he had not sent someone to ask her to leave. No one came. She went home and told her son she might have something. Claudette Morrow had grown up in a 2-story house in western Louisiana that smelled like pine resin and boiled crawfish and the particular kind of damp that comes from living 15 feet above the water table. Her mother, Estelle Morrow, had been a licensed practical nurse for 31 years. Not an RN, an LPN, which meant she did the same work for less money and fewer of the protections that came with a different set of initials. Estelle worked the day shift at a long-term care facility outside of Shreveport. She came home smelling like latex gloves and institutional soap and never once said a word against the work, because the work was how the lights stayed on, and the house stayed warm and Claudette stayed in schools. Claudette's father had left before Claudette could form a clear memory of him. What remained was not grief. It was a set of practical observations she had made as a child and stored without drama. He was gone. the rent was still due. These two facts were not connected emotionally. They were connected structurally. Her mother understood this. She raised Claudette accordingly. Estelle taught Claudette to read a hospital chart at the kitchen table, the same way other mothers might teach a child to read a recipe. Not because she expected Claudette to go into nursing, because Claudette was going to go into something, and the habits of precision and accuracy and careful documentation were going to matter in whatever that something turned out to be. Claudette went into hospital administration. She started as a billing coordinator at a small regional hospital in Baton Rouge at 23 years old. She was good at it the way her mother was good at patient care. Not naturally, through repetition and attention, and a refusal to let a number be wrong just because correcting it was inconvenient. She worked her way to compliance director over 17 years. She built a department from 2 people and a shared filing cabinet to a team of 9 with a documented audit system that the state health inspector had cited as a model 3 years running. She was not looking for recognition. She was looking for the work to be done correctly, and when it was done correctly, recognition followed as a side effect. She was 44 when the hospital was acquired. The acquiring system was called Meridian Health Partners. They came in with a consulting team and a transition timeline and language about synergies and operational alignment. What they brought practically was a new org chart that had fewer boxes on it than the old one. Claudette's position was eliminated in the second round of restructuring. She was given a severance package and a letter thanking her for 17 years of service. The letter was signed by someone whose name she did not recognize. She took 3 months and found another position. Compliance manager at a mid-sized orthopedic network in Dallas. She stayed for 4 years. When that organization merged with a national group, her role was again absorbed into a centralized structure that did not require someone local. She was 49. She had 17 years of documented experience, 3 state-level commendations, and a resume that kept running into the same wall. Overqualified for the positions available. Not the right fit for the positions she wanted. Old enough that the word experienced had started to carry a different weight in the rooms where people made hiring decisions. She moved back to Louisiana. Her son, Daniel, was 26 and working at a logistics company in Baton Rouge. He had offered to help pay rent. She had declined in the way that people who have been financially independent for 3 decades decline help, firmly, without explanation, and with the full knowledge that the offer meant something, even if the answer was no. She spent 8 months applying. She sent out 43 applications. She received 9 responses. Of those 9, 4 led to interviews. Of the 4 interviews, none led to an offer. Not one person said her experience was insufficient. What they said, in different words with the same meaning, was that she was a category they did not know how to place. She was not bitter. She was precise. She understood that bitterness was an emotion without a target, and she had a specific target. She just had not found it yet. She found it on a Tuesday afternoon in the public library on Government Street. She had been reading Meridian Health Partners' annual reports. Not the current one, the archived ones going back 11 years, to the year the company first expanded into Louisiana. She was reading them the way her mother had taught her to read a chart, not for what was there, for what was missing and what the missing thing implied. She found the gap in the 4th report, a footnote in the risk disclosure section referencing a legal settlement from a facility acquisition in southwestern Louisiana in 2013. The settlement amount was not disclosed. The nature of this dispute was described in 7 words, resolved without admission of liability or fault. 7 words. She had spent 20 years in compliance. She knew what 7 words in a risk disclosure footnote could cover. She pulled the public EEOC records for Meridian Health Partners for that year. She pulled the state health department complaint logs. She pulled the civil court docket for the parish where the acquisition had occurred. It took her 3 Saturdays. What she found was the outline of something she recognized. A long-term care facility in Calcasieu Parish had been acquired by Meridian in 2013. Within 14 months of the acquisition, the facility's staffing ratio had been reduced by 22%. 3 formal complaints had been filed with the state health department by staff members citing unsafe patient loads. All 3 complaints had been reviewed and closed. The reviewing officer at the state level had signed off on all 3 within 30 days of filing, which was unusually fast for a complaint of that type. One of the 3 staff members who filed the complaints was a licensed practical nurse named Estelle Rena Morrow. Claudette sat in the library and read her mother's name in a civil complaint document and did not move for a long time. She had known her mother had filed something. Estelle had told her, briefly, in the way Estelle told her most things. Factually, without drama, the way you describe a structural problem in a foundation to someone who will understand what it means. She said she had reported the staffing levels. She said the report had gone nowhere. She said she had kept working because the patients still needed care, regardless of what the state did or did not do about her complaint. Estelle Rena Morrow had retired at 63, 2 years ahead of plan, because her knees had given out from decades of a job that required standing. She had not complained about the knees any more than she had complained about the staffing ratios or the salary that never reflected the work. She moved in with Claudette's aunt in Lake Charles and grew tomatoes in the backyard and watched the evening news and called Claudette every Sunday at 7. She had died on a Wednesday morning in April. She was 68. The cause was listed as cardiac arrest. What Claudette knew, because she had sat with her mother's doctor and read the chart herself, was that the underlying condition was a progressive and largely silent heart disease that had been missed at a routine physical 2 years earlier, because the clinic her mother used operated on a 35-minute appointment model that did not allow adequate time for the secondary screening that would have caught it. She had not sued. She did not have the money to fund a lawsuit against a healthcare system, and she had watched enough of them to know what the process did to the people inside it. She had grieved. She had gone back to work. She had carried what happened the way her mother had carried the staffing complaint, factually, precisely, without putting it down. What she had not done until 3 Saturdays in a library was trace the full shape of it. The reviewing officer who had signed off on her mother's staffing complaint in 30 days was named Philip Garnett. He had left the state health department in 2016. He was currently the Director of Quality and Compliance at Hargrove Medical Center. His office was on the 7th floor. He had been there for 9 years. He attended the board's quarterly governance review. He sat at the table and presented outcome data. He was scheduled to present at the next meeting in 11 days. Claudette did not go to Hargrove Medical Center to apply for a job in dietary services. She went because the man who had buried her mother's safety report was on the 7th floor, and she needed to be inside the building. HR called her on Saturday. She was offered a position in materials management, supply intake and distribution, Monday through Friday, 6 to 3. The pay was $17.40 an hour. She started Monday. The materials management department was located on the lower level of the main building, adjacent to the loading dock. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that became invisible after the 3rd day. Supplies came in through a dock on the south end. Internal distribution moved through a cart-based system that had been the same for at least a decade, judging by the wear on the wheels and the handwritten labels on half the storage bins. The woman who ran the department was named Bertrice Louise Okafor. She was 64 years old and had worked at Hargrove for 22 years. She had seen 4 CEOs, 2 building expansions, and 1 complete overhaul of the hospital's electronic health records system that had, by general consensus, made everything harder for 18 months before making it marginally better. She watched Claudette on the first morning, not obviously. The way you watch someone when you are trying to determine whether they are going to need a lot of explaining or not very much. By the second morning, she had her answer. Claudette moved through the inventory system the way someone moves through a language they have spoken before. Methodical, unhurried, accurate. She did not ask where things went twice. "You have done this kind of work before," Bertrice said on the third morning. "I have done all kinds of work," Claudette said. Bertrice did not ask what that meant. She had been working in a hospital basement long enough to know that when someone gives you that kind of answer, you wait. The rest comes eventually, and it always means more when it arrives without being pulled. What Bertrice did not see was what Claudette was reading. Every supply requisition that moved through materials management carried information. Department codes, requesting supervisor names, budget line references, cross-departmental patterns, which floors ordered what and how often, and whether the ordering frequency matched what you would expect for the patient volume those floors reported. Claudette was not just processing requisitions. She was reading the building the way her mother had taught her to read a chart. Not for what was there, for what the gaps implied. She also began spending her lunch breaks in the hospital's public cafeteria on the third floor, which was the floor below the administrative offices. She ate quietly. She listened. Hospital administrators talk over lunch the way people in any institution talk over lunch, about the things that are frustrating them, about the meetings they just came from, about the things that are not working. She did not take notes. She did not need to. She had spent 20 years in rooms where institutional dysfunction was the primary subject of conversation. She knew how to absorb structure from conversation. On day 11, she found the discrepancy, a recurring supply order from the 7th floor. The Compliance and Quality Division included a line item that had appeared every quarter for the past 3 years. External consulting services, materials. She had not flagged it because it was not her job to flag it, but the line item was routed through materials management rather than through the administrative procurement system, which was where external consulting expenses were supposed to be processed. The routing was wrong, not dramatically wrong, the kind of wrong that you only notice if you know what the right routing looks like, which most people in materials management did not, because most people in materials management had not spent 20 years in hospital compliance. She noted it. She said nothing. She moved on. On day 16, she found the second discrepancy. A documentation log for a 2019 state audit of the hospital's staffing ratios in the long-term care wing had been filed under a reference code that placed it in the archived general compliance records rather than in the active policy review files. The log was accessible through the internal system. It was not hidden. It was simply filed in a place where no one with a reason to look at it was likely to look. Claudette had a reason. The 2019 audit had been conducted following a staff complaint about patient-to-nurse ratios in the extended care unit. The complaint had been reviewed and closed in 26 days. The reviewing officer was Philip Garnett. She read the audit notes carefully. Then she read the complaint itself. Then she read the closure documentation. The closure documentation cited a corrective action plan that the facility had agreed to implement. The corrective action plan was dated, signed, and filed. What was not in the folder was any evidence that the plan had been monitored for implementation. No follow-up audit, no compliance verification, no documentation of any kind showing that anyone had checked whether the corrective action had actually been taken. She sat at the terminal in the lower-level records room and looked at the folder for a long time. It was not her mother's complaint. It was a different complaint, in a different year, in a different facility. But it was the same shape. A concern raised. A process followed. A box checked. And then silence where the accountability should have been. She did not copy the file. Not then. She logged out. She went back to the loading dock and signed for 3 pallets of wound care supplies and processed the intake paperwork without making a single error. That evening she sat at Daniel's kitchen's table because she had given up her own apartment 6 months into the job search and was staying in the second bedroom that still had his childhood soccer trophies on the shelf. She put her mother's reading glasses on the table beside her laptop. Estelle had kept them in a case that had the state of Louisiana embossed on the side, a souvenir from a trip to the Capitol she had taken with a church group in 2004. Claudette did not need the glasses. They were just there. The way certain things are just there, present and visible, not spoken about, not put away. She looked at the documents she had gathered over 3 weeks. The library records, the EEOC filings, the civil court docket, the internal audit closure without follow-through, the misfield requisition line item. Separately, they were not much. Together, they were a structure she recognized, not corruption in the dramatic sense. Something quieter and more durable. A system that had been taught, over time, that checking the box was the same as doing the work. That filing the report was the same as resolving the problem. That closing the complaint was the same as answering it. Her mother had filed a complaint about staffing. The complaint had been closed in 30 days. The staffing had not changed. She did not make any decisions that night. She made a list, not of actions, of questions she needed to be able to answer before she acted. What was the board's oversight structure for quality and compliance? Who reviewed the director of quality's own compliance record? When had the hospital last been subject to an external independent audit, not a state review, an independent one? And what would happen, specifically, to the patients in the extended care wing if someone with full access to the documentation presented the pattern to the board rather than to the department? It took her 4 more days to answer the questions. On day 23, she wrote a report. It was 11 pages. She did not use emotional language. She did not reference her mother by name. She did not reference her own employment history, or her 8 months of rejections, or the job interviews that had gone nowhere. She wrote it the way Estelle had written her staffing complaint in 2013, and the way Claudette had written audit findings for 17 years. Here is the data. Here is the pattern the data describes. Here is what the pattern costs when it is not corrected. Here is what correction would require. She identified 3 instances over 9 years in which compliance complaints at Hargrove-affiliated facilities had been closed without documented follow-through. She identified the financial cost of the resulting incidents: 2 malpractice settlements, 1 CMS penalty, 1 state citation that had required an emergency staffing corrective action 18 months after the original complaint was closed. She calculated what independent monitoring would have cost versus what the unmonitored failures had cost. The ratio was 1 to 9. Every dollar not spent on monitoring had produced $9 in consequence. She did not include slide 19, not yet. She placed the report on Dr. Evershaw's desk at 5:40 in the afternoon. She left the building. She went home and sat with Daniel and watched a game she did not follow and ate the soup he made on Fridays, because he cooked on Fridays the way Estelle had cooked on Sundays, not out of obligation, out of habit built from love. He asked how the job was going. She said she thought it might become permanent. He looked at her the way children look at their parents when they suspect the sentence means more than it says. She did not explain. Not yet. Dr. Evershaw read the report at 6:15 the next morning. He read it straight through. Then he went back to page 4 and read it again. He sat at his desk for several minutes without picking up the phone. He was a man who had spent 14 years reading compliance reports, and this one was better than most of what his compliance division produced. It was sourced entirely from the hospital's own internal records. It cited publicly available state and federal data with precision. It identified a pattern that was not dramatic, but was also not explainable as coincidence. It had been written by a woman who had been working in materials management for 23 days. He called her to his office at 8. She arrived in the same gray blazer. She sat when he offered the chair. He had the report on his desk. This is thorough. Yes. How did you access the archived audit records? Through the internal system. The records are available to any staff member with a department clearance. He looked at her. Most people with department clearance have not read them. Most people were not looking for what I was looking for. He was quiet for a moment. He was a man who did not ask questions he was not prepared to hear the answer to. What were you looking for? A pattern I thought I recognized. I was correct. He looked at the report again. He looked at her. There is a board governance committee meeting in 5 days. I want you to present this. Claudette looked at him the way you look at a door you have been standing in front of for a long time. The full committee, 7 members. You will present the findings from pages 1 through 11. She looked at him for a moment. I have one additional section I would want to include. He held her gaze. She held his. Bring it Monday. We review before the meeting. She nodded once. She stood. She walked to the door, opened it, and stepped into the hallway and pressed the elevator button. And stood in the corridor of the 7th floor for the first time, and looked at the door with Philip Garnett's name on it 40 feet away, and did not feel anything she had not already decided what to do with. She had 4 days. That night she sat at the kitchen table again. Daniel was in the other room. The reading glasses were on the table. The laptop was open. The presentation was 14 slides. The compliance pattern, the documentation gaps, the cost analysis, the corrective action recommendations. Structured, sourced, clean. Then she opened slide 15. She built it over 2 hours, not because the data was difficult to find, because she needed to be certain that every number was right and every citation was accurate and every claim could be verified by anyone in that room who wanted to verify it. The slide was titled, Complaint Resolution Without Verification. A case study. She traced the 2013 staffing complaint at the Calcasieu Parish facility. She traced the 30-day closure. She traced the absence of any follow-up verification. She traced the staffing levels at that facility 18 months after closure and compared them to the levels reported in the original complaint. They were within 2% of each other. The complaint had been reviewed. The box had been checked. Nothing had changed. She did not put her mother's name on the slide. She put the numbers. She calculated what adequate staffing would have cost the facility per quarter versus what the facility had paid in accelerated staff turnover, overtime coverage, and one EEOC settlement in the 3 years following the complaint. The numbers told the story without needing any additional framing. The reviewing officer for the 2013 complaint was listed by title and transition date. Current role, Director of Quality and Compliance, Hargrove Medical Center. She did not name him. His title named him. She finished at 11. She closed the laptop. She picked up her mother's glasses and held them for a moment. The case was scuffed at one corner from years in Estelle's coat pocket. The Louisiana embossing on the side had faded to almost nothing. Estelle Morrow had spent 31 years doing the work correctly, because the patients needed it done correctly. She had filed a report when the system stopped supporting the work, because that was what you did when you saw something wrong. She had trusted that the report would matter. She had been wrong about that part, but she had not been wrong about anything else. Claudette put the glasses back on the table. Tomorrow, she said to no one and to everyone. The governance committee met on a Thursday at 9. The room was on the 8th floor. 6 of the 7 members were present when Claudette entered. The 7th arrived 2 minutes after her. Philip Garnett sat along the side wall in his capacity as Director of Quality, present to respond to departmental questions if the committee had them. Dr. Evershaw introduced her with 2 sentences. This is Claudette Morrow from Materials Management. She identified something the department did not. The room did what rooms do when an unfamiliar person is presented without context. 7 sets of eyes moved from Dr. Evershaw to Claudette. Some looked at her blazer. Some looked at her age. One looked at the folder she carried. Philip Garnett looked at the table. Claudette connected the laptop. She opened the first slide. The hospital's compliance oversight structure, as currently documented, relies on a single review model for formal complaints received from clinical staff. Between 2014 and 2023, 14 such complaints were filed across Hargrove-affiliated facilities. Of those 14, 11 were reviewed and closed by the same office. Of the 11 closures, 4 included corrective action plans. Of the 4 corrective action plans, none has documentation of independent follow-up verification. She moved through the slides the way she moved through inventory. Without pausing. Without hedging, with the precision of someone who has checked the work before presenting it, and is not concerned about being challenged on the numbers because the numbers are right. By slide 5, the committee member at the end of the table had leaned forward. By slide 9, the woman to Evershaw's left had stopped writing and was looking at the screen. Questions came. Claudette answered each one the way she had answered questions in compliance reviews for 20 years. Exactly what was asked, nothing more. How were these records accessed? Through standard staff-level internal system access. The records are not restricted. Were the corrective action failures reported externally? Not systematically. Individual incidents were reported when they triggered external thresholds. The pattern across incidents was not compiled. Who is responsible for verifying corrective action implementation? Under the current structure, the same office that issues the closure recommendation. Philip Garnett had not moved. His hands were on the table. His pen was uncapped but had not touched paper in 20 minutes. Claudette reached slide 14. The committee had the full analysis. The findings were complete, the recommendations clear, the data sourced and verifiable. Dr. Evershaw began to speak. I have one additional section. He stopped. The room was quiet. He looked at her. She looked at him. He nodded. She opened slide 15. She began the way she had begun every other section. In 2013, a licensed practical nurse at a Meridian-affiliated long-term care facility in Calcasieu Parish filed a formal complaint with the state health department citing unsafe patient-to-staff ratios. The complaint was reviewed and closed in 30 days. The reviewing officer's closure documentation cited a corrective action plan agreed to by the facility. No follow-up verification was conducted. Staffing levels at the facility 18 months after closure remained within 2% of the levels described in the original complaint. She clicked to the next slide, a single-column comparison. Cost of adequate staffing versus cost of turnover, overtime, and settlement in the 36 months following complaint closure. The cost of not verifying the corrective action was 14 times the cost of verifying it. The room was still. She clicked to the final slide. The reviewing officer for the 2013 complaint transitioned to his current role at Hargrove Medical Center in 2016. He has held oversight responsibility for the facility's quality and compliance function for 9 years. She paused. The nurse who filed the 2013 complaint was my mother. She spent 31 years providing patient care in facilities across this state. She trusted the complaint process because she had been told the complaint process existed to protect patients. She did not need to say the next part. The room already understood what happens when a complaint process exists to check a box rather than solve the problem. It protects no one. She closed the laptop. The room emptied in the way rooms empty after they have received something that requires time to become a decision. Committee members gathered papers and moved toward the door without the usual corridor conversation. 2 nodded to Claudette as they passed. 1 stopped and said her name and nothing else, which was enough. Philip Garnett remained seated. He was looking at the table. Then he stood. He picked up his folder. He did not look at Claudette and he did not look at Evershaw. He walked to the door and opened it, and his footsteps on the carpet made no sound at all. Dr. Evershaw remained. He stood by the window for a moment and then turned. You did not come here for a materials management position. I came for both, the position and the answer. What answer? Whether this institution would do the right thing when the evidence was in front of it. He was quiet. He was a man who had built his career on efficiency, on outcomes, on the belief that a system designed correctly would produce correct results. He was looking at a woman who had spent 23 days in a basement processing supply orders and had produced a more accurate picture of the institution's compliance failures than the department whose specific function was to see exactly that. What do you want? She told him. An independent audit of every corrective action closure in the past 10 years. A revised oversight structure that separates the complaint review function from the verification function, and a position, not in materials management, that gives her the access and the authority to build a monitoring process that actually monitors. Not because of her mother, Because of the 14 complaints and the 4 corrective action plans and the 0 verification records. Because the data said the problem was structural and structural problems required structural correction. He nodded once. The audit starts next week. Philip Garnett submitted his resignation on a Monday. He did not wait for the audit to conclude. He had reviewed his own records over the weekend, and he understood what the audit would find. He knew exactly how many complaints he had closed in 30 days or fewer. He knew exactly how many corrective action plans he had signed off on without building in any mechanisms to determine whether the correction had occurred. He had done it the same way he had done everything in his career, efficiently, within the parameters of the required process, and with a consistent preference for speed over depth that he had never once been asked to justify. He had not been careless. He had been comfortable. And he had been comfortable for long enough that he had stopped being able to tell the difference between the two. The restructuring took 3 months. The new oversight function was called Clinical Accountability and Patient Safety. It reported directly to the Chief of Medicine. Claudette was named its director, not as a concession, as a correction. Dr. Evershaw told her on a Friday, the same way he told her most things, directly, without preamble, with the implication that the decision had been made and what remained was implementation. She accepted. She did not tell him that standing in the lobby 5 weeks earlier, calculating the angle of his path to the elevator. She had not known whether any of this was possible. She had only known that the shape of what had happened to her mother required someone to stand in front of it and name it clearly, and she was the only person she knew who had both the knowledge and the reason. That evening, she drove to Lake Charles. She had not been since the previous November. She sat in the backyard of her aunt's house for an hour in the early evening light and did not speak much and did not need to. The tomato plants her mother had started were still there, still producing, tended now by her aunt with the same stubborn regularity that Estelle had applied to everything she had ever decided was worth keeping alive. She had brought the reading glasses with her. She put them on the garden table and left them there. She drove home in the dark. Daniel was waiting up. He did not ask where she had been. He made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, and he asked her what the new job was called, and she told him. He was quiet for a moment. She would have liked that, he said. Yes, did she know you were going to do this? Claudette looked at the table. The glasses were gone. She had left them in the garden. That was where they needed to be now. She taught me how to read a chart, Claudette said. She just did not know which one I would end up reading. There are people in every institution who have been looking at the same broken process for years and have filed the complaint and watched the box get checked and returned to work because the patients still needed care even if the system did not. They did not stop working. They did not stop watching. They did not stop believing that the report mattered, even when it produced nothing. They were right to believe it. They were just filing it with the wrong person. Sometimes, the person who finally files it with the right person is the one who had no reason to be in the building, except the most important reason of all. If this story made you think of someone who raised a complaint and was told it had been handled when it had only been filed, share it. Not because sharing changes the record. Because being seen by even one other person is different from being invisible. And different is where things begin. Estelle Morrow filed her complaint on a Tuesday in October. She went back to work on Wednesday because her patients needed her. She never heard anything more about it. She did not know that 23 days inside a building, her daughter entered through the loading dock, would eventually put that complaint in front of 7 people who could not look away from it. But she had taught her daughter to read. And some documents, once read correctly, cannot be unfiled.